environment, public safety, and economic development. So as a key component of the response to those challenges, the City Council, under his leadership, recently approved the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, which I think he's going to spend some time talking to you all about this afternoon. Moving a little bit closer to home, we UTSA are incredibly fortunate to have Mayor Nirenberg as as a strong partner and friend, especially when it comes to the revitalization and expansion of our downtown campus. A little bit closer to home, in particular to the College of Sciences, we're really grateful to have received awards from the San Antonio Proposition 1 Edwards Aquifer Protection projects for things like a new large bioswale, which will be running through the campus. I understand that ground will be broken on that pretty soon, and a new living laboratory on West Campus, where students such as yourselves can deliver a curriculum regarding aquifer protection to the San Antonio community. And so, without further ado, please welcome the Mayor of San Antonio.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you?
Great.
Thank you to Mr. Thompson for allowing me to speak with you today. This has been something we've been talking about for a while, and I'm thrilled to be back here on campus. I used to be the city councilman in this area, and obviously spent a lot of time on the main campus. My name is Ron Nirenburg. I've been mayor since 2017. In 2013, I was elected as the District 8 City Councilman, and then I chose to run for mayor in 2017 after a couple of terms. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on at the city, kind of what we're facing, and ultimately that will lead to what I really want to discuss, and that is the city's Climate Action and Adaptation Plan that was just ratified by City Council. And then I'd really just like to have a conversation with you and get your questions, maybe get some of your thoughts and ideas, because this is very much an inflection point for our city. Raise your hand if you were born and raised in San Antonio. Okay, not quite half. I wasn't born here, but I got here in 1995 to go to school from Austin. And I came here at a time when San Antonio was starting to evolve quite a bit. In fact, I came in the mid-90s, and I really didn't think I was going to stay here past school, but by the time I left in 99, I had fallen in love with this city. It was growing, it was becoming a place where you could find a career of your choice no matter what you were studying, which wasn't the case even 20, 30 years ago. It was also a place that was starting to respect its natural heritage, and there was a lot of things going on like the creekway system, which I'm sure you've traveled on. It's connected to the campus now. And a lot of things happening downtown in the urban core that we hadn't seen for many, many years. Well, San Antonio, as you might know, is the 7th most populous city in the United States now. It's been a top 10 city for a while. It also happens to be one of the fastest growing cities in the entire United States. In fact, the last 2 years, according to the American Community Survey, we have been number 1 and number 2 fastest growing metros in the entire country. Texas itself is one of the few fast growing states. If you go to both coasts, you'll see that's not quite the case. I did my graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. For the greater part of the decade of the early 2000s, it was actually a shrinking city. A lot of major cities are starting to see a shrinking in their population. Cities in Texas, though, are going in the other direction. San Antonio is also a sprawling city. I don't have to tell you that. Wherever you want to go, it takes a car ride in an Uber or your own personal vehicle. Otherwise, you're pretty much stranded. This is a city of 500 square miles with a population of about 1.5 million, which means that we don't have quite as much density as a lot of other cities that you've probably been to. And you can see that as you go through the city, a lot of pockets of undeveloped area, some of them green, some of them not, a lot of suburbs that are really spread out and sprawling. One of the symptoms of that is that we lack a public transportation system. How many of you would love to have a public transportation system that you can rely on? Almost everybody. I agree with you. And anyone who's spent some time in another city of our size or larger typically you would find one. In fact, we're one of the last remaining big cities in the country that has really no mass transit system of any kind. We do have a bus system, but it's not a mass transit system. So I'm painting a picture of a city that in age sense is sort of in its adolescence. We haven't really grown up yet. In fact, the choices that we make in this day and age in our community will really bear out over the next 20 or 30 years to determine what kind of city we want to be. There's a lot of great things about San Antonio, besides our sports teams, and besides the great universities and the wonderful heritage that we have here, unlike any other city in the country. The heritage of San Antonio is unique in the world. But there's some enormous challenges. I mentioned a couple of them already. Public transportation, we don't have one. And to build one, it requires a lot of capital, especially one that has to spread out over 500 square miles. We also are a city that, from a climatological standpoint, has been an arid part of this country. Believe it or not, the reason why this community was settled 5,000 years ago in the middle of an arid part of Texas was because underneath our feet is the world's largest single source aquifer that springs out of the ground without any pumping or equipment required. It's actually God's miracle as to why people are actually in this part of Texas, the Edwards Aquifer. They followed the water. But other than that, the climate in San Antonio has been relatively dry. From a socioeconomic standpoint, I don't need to tell you, the first part of the 20th century was not exactly an equal one for people in our community. In fact, redlining, racist policies that were on the books and have been long since ruled unconstitutional kept certain members of our community, population, based on the color of their skin from actually developing, living in parts of our community. And it has developed that way over time, even though those policies are no longer on the books. So we have a city that has been geographically and now socioeconomically segregated, and it has led to a lot of exacerbated problems, where some parts of town have actually had fewer resources to maintain their communities. Anybody spend any amount of time on the east side of San Antonio? Some rough streets and infrastructure in that area? Well, I'm proud to say for the first time in our city's history, we're starting to address that. In 1977, the city changed by virtue of a federal court ruling from a city council elected all at large to single member districts, so that the community on the east side would have a representative, a seat on the city council, so that they could fight for the resources that are necessary in their side of the community. It wasn't until 2017 that we actually started doing that, though, because if you look at geographic political boundaries, we have a city that has 10 equal size council districts, right? District 1 through 10. We're in District 8. Typically on a body of city council members, a political body, everyone's fighting for their fair share, so ultimately, based on the big pot of resources that we have to budget for, everybody gets an equal amount. But what happens when you're 3 generations behind in terms of infrastructure repair on an area of town that also happens to drain and flood out a lot more often? Well, that community continues to slip further and further behind. I'll give you an example as to why equal actually ends up exacerbating socioeconomic inequities. Well, in this part of town, we're built on limestone. You can build a linear mile of street in this community, spend a certain amount of money to do that. In 30 years, that street is just about now requiring some maintenance. You do the same thing on an area that's built in clay, like the east side. In 3 years, you're gonna have to do a full base repair on that particular street. And so you can see, if you're allocating the same amount of resources every year to each side, one area of town is gonna fall further and further behind. So in 2017, we decided to change things. We decided to use an equity lens. I don't know if anyone has heard that phrase before, an equity lens, meaning that rather than just budgeting everything by equal slices, we're going to apply the greatest amount of resources where they're needed the most. So the east side, for instance, got a huge amount more, not a huge amount, a significant amount more for infrastructure repair, slowly bringing up the speed. We've continued that over the last 3 years. We were one of the first big cities in the country to employ that kind of budgeting. And it's not just about infrastructure, it's also about how we deliver services. Some services are needed more in certain parts of the community than others, and so that's where we should allocate the resources. It makes common sense, right? And so we're starting to do that. So if you look at the work that we've done at City Council, it's really about making sure that in 20 or 30 years from now, San Antonio has a place where it doesn't matter what side of town you live on, what side of town you're born on, you have an equal opportunity to thrive. You all know intrinsically, I guess, that certain health outcomes are correlated to certain socioeconomic levels of prosperity, right? Poverty is generally associated with lower educational outcomes, which is also associated with lower economic opportunity, which is also associated with poorer health outcomes, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and ultimately fatal levels of those particular issues. Did you know that based on some socioeconomic research in our community, the dividing line north-south, everything south of Hilderbrand Drive, for instance, for years had a lower life expectancy by about 10 years, meaning that a child, simply because they were born on the wrong side of town, luck of the draw genetically, I guess, means that they would have a less likelihood of getting a good job, getting a good education, and living the same amount of time on Earth as their peers on the North. Those things are being addressed. We're working on that. We're applying an equity lens to the health work that we're doing at the city. So how do I get to climate? Well, the same level of concern for the future, but also the level of economic opportunity, health opportunity for our community bears out in our city and also bears out across the world. We know that, for instance, based on the science, that the hot days are getting hotter, right? The average temperature in the summer over the last, I think, 20 years, don't quote me, I have the research in there, is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit higher than it was 20 years ago. We also know that the level of rainfall biennial rainfall over that same period of time is down about 2 inches. Don't fact check the actual numbers I'm giving you. It's roughly, I'm telling you the story, but it's generally you get the picture. We also know that the level of intensity of the storms that we're experiencing is getting higher, right? The level of rainfall per rain event, when we do have them, is getting more intense. And then, of course, we know that as a result of all these things, certain areas of our world, even in our United States, are getting, they're climatologically changing. Deserts are expanding. Water is rising. Coastal communities are starting to have to worry about how they build their cities in terms of not getting flooded out. We've had to do the same thing. You know how many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars we've spent since the floods of 1998 just to make sure that homes aren't flooded out of existence here in our community? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So all of this is happening, and people all across our city, all across the state, the country, and the world are having to deal with this, adapt to the changing climate. And some scientists, in fact most scientists, have agreed, come to a consensus that there are some things that are causing this, and that humans are part of that, and that the emissions that are caused by human industrial activity, greenhouse gas emissions, are exacerbating the issue. So here we are in 2019 with a body of knowledge, research that continues to get more precise, that is telling us that the climate is changing. We have some degree of control over that. That if it continues on this pace, we're going to see entire communities wiped off the face of the earth because they're going to be underwater at some point. But also, even inland, where deserts are expanding, they're becoming, it's much more difficult to sustain the kinds of species that are there that other species depend on for food and survival. Those things are happening. There are companies now that are starting to prepare for that because, you know, planning for eventualities actually makes good business sense. And then, of course, we have the national security community that says, well, those kinds of things happening throughout the world generally causes civil unrest, so we ought to be concerned about that too. So that's where we are. Well, not to get too political, but we had a plan for that. And we're getting better with the plan. We have some actions in place. We're trying to electrify more of our fleet. We're trying to lower emissions. We're trying to deal with better technologies that will help lower emissions and industrial activity that we depend on for survival. We're trying to get smarter. We try to pass clean energy policies. And we do that in accord with the communities that we have here locally, but also communities around the world. And it rose to a fever pitch in 2015, where mayors around the world gathered, along with leaders of states, nation states, gathered in Paris to talk about what are some basic standards that we can all commit ourselves to, changes that we can shoot for, that make good business sense, that make good national security sense, that make good health sense, and so forth, that we can promise to each other, and not necessarily just to each other, but to our offspring, future generations, that we're going to work towards these outcomes because scientifically, we know it will make a difference. So they came up with some agreements on greenhouse gas emissions targets, fleet reductions of emissions from fleets, things that are better for the circular economy, waste reduction techniques, things better for air quality and water quality as well. And they called the agreement the Paris Climate Agreement, the Paris Climate Accords. Almost every major nation in the world agreed to it, and you can judge for yourself the sincerity of all of those nation actors, but we agreed to it. And in fact, there were side meetings going on with the mayors. I wasn't part of there, I wasn't the mayor at the time. Had I been, I would have been there. But everyone agreed to essentially the same principles were that, and the big one was that we were going to achieve as local communities carbon neutrality by 2050. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that you're not producing cattle anymore, or that all of your industrial activities are zero, or that my neighbor's 77 Chevrolet has to be off the street and not operating. It means that as a community as a community, we would commit that we didn't produce any more greenhouse gas emissions than we actually were able to remove. That we have technologies, and some of this is a little bit of a leap of faith. Any futurists here? Well, I'm not a futurist either, but what I've heard is that they have charted the growth and development of technology to show that there is actually exponential growth in technology, that we can actually be very confident that technologies are developed at the pace at which communities need them and see business interests and civic interest in them created. So there will be technologies that are produced that help us reach some of these goals. We can be confident in that. And one of the other big goals for the climate accords was that we were going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions collectively as a globe, so that scientifically we could show that it was going to limit the rise in temperature, because we can't stop it. but we can limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Small amount, but that's an average temperature, and that small amount actually has pretty significant impacts on species, on water, on all the things that I'm talking about when it comes to impact on climate. So we agree to that. Well, I don't need to remind anyone what has happened since then. Politically, a lot of things. One of the key things being in 2016, the United States removed itself from the Accords, one of the largest emitters in the entire world. Removed ourselves from that agreement. So what happens next? Well, our communities still have to deal with the consequences. Removing yourself from a political agreement, a consensus, an accord, doesn't change the scientific realities or the outcomes and the things that we're facing as a local community. So what you saw in response was mayors around the country and around the globe, actually most of them were still in already, but mayors around this country forming their own network. Because ultimately it's not the federal government that's going to be creating these changes, it's actually local communities that are driving the cars, creating the energy, doing all the things with waste reduction that we were going to have to do anyways. So we agreed amongst ourselves in a network called the Mayor's Climate Action Network that we're going to live up to the Accords anyways. And we're going to call it We're Still In. So that's where we are. 2016, that group formed. 2017, I ran for and was elected mayor. On the first day that I was sworn in office, I put on the city council's agenda a resolution for us to formally join the Paris Climate Accord. And it passed 10-1, or 9-1 at the time. Since that time, we've been working on what do we do next? Because a resolution to say that we're going to follow the Paris Climate Accord, the global consensus on where we need to be as local communities, is simply a symbolic act. It's no better than the paper it's written on if we don't act from that. So what we resolved to do, which is what the agreement actually called for, is for us to come up with what has now been ratified as a city council, which is the San Antonio Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, CAAP for short. In that report, which has taken 2 years to produce, is a series of steps, roadmap. One thing you have to know about a plan that's passed by a city government is that it's also no better than the paper it's written on. It requires action. It's like a map that sits in your car. Actually, anybody drive a car before they had GPS? Remember those big maps you had to fold out? You follow it. If you don't follow it, it's on you, but it's a roadmap. It tells you how to get where you're going. We know where we want to get to where we're going. The CAAP is a roadmap, and it goes through different steps like, what do we have to do in terms of changing the way we produce energy in this community? San Antonio is lucky. Our public owns our CPS energy system. Believe it or not, you own an energy system, which is the largest publicly owned energy system in the entire country. It's a nonprofit. The revenues that are produced actually go back into your neighborhoods to produce roads and public safety services and libraries and parks and so forth. How do we change the way they produce energy to ultimately get to where we want to go with the Accord? It also talks about how we're going to change our city's system of transportation. So we're adding, anyone want to guess how many cars we're adding to San Antonio roadways every single day? Want to take a wild guess?
80.
Bob said 80. Higher or lower?
Higher.
You're right. You're right. In the metro area, it's about 150. So, and I don't have to tell you that as soon as your city and your state are done with a road construction project, whenever that is, what happens to traffic after that? It's already packed, it's congested, right? Well, the largest, actually next to the way we produce energy and we use it in buildings like this, the almost the same amount of emissions is produced by us sitting in traffic all day. So what can we do about that? Well, we can change the kind of cars we're going to drive, but I can't tell you what you're going to drive, right? I hope there's probably more lower emission options available for you. You drive an electric vehicle, good on you. But for those of you who don't want to drive a car, we should have options, and more efficient options. It gets you to point A or point B faster, like on an electric bus or a low emissions bus, or maybe even a mass transit vehicle. Some say light rail. I say we don't even need that if we have light rail on wheels. Just get people from point A to point B as fast as you can, efficiently. So you get a sense of the things that we have to do. We also have to change the way we deal with waste reduction in this community. Wouldn't it be better? 66% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by the municipality, the city government, come from landfills, believe it. Landfills. The methane that's produced from even landfills that are closed, 66%. So there's a lot of emissions, there's a lot of things that we can do better on with technology and also just being smarter that we can help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And ultimately that roadmap is intended for us to live up to the promise that we made to each other back in Paris, and we made to each other here in 2017 when we agreed to sign on to it. But ultimately we have to deal with it. So where are we now? We have a ratified plan, it's called the CAAP. It lays out a series of options. We also have the politics of dealing with this kind of thing. Anybody who thought that the hard fight of climate change is now thankfully over in San Antonio is sadly mistaken. The easy part was drafting and ratifying that plan. Now we have to make the more difficult decisions. San Antonio in 2010 decided it wasn't going to go nuclear because we were about to sign on to a pretty raw deal that would have cost you a lot of money unnecessarily. So we decided to forego a nuclear plant. We still have nuclear in our portfolio, but we passed on a new nuclear plant and instead focused on conservation and becoming the largest solar generator in the entire southern United States, which we are now. We're the largest in Texas, and now, because other cities have caught up, other communities have caught up, we're number 7 in the nation. But because of all that, we've saved, over the course of the last 10 years, 771 megawatts of energy that we simply didn't even produce, which has helped lower emissions. And in fact, since 2016 to 2018, we, just by virtue of the things that we were doing that we know are smart, that aren't, before this plan was actually ratified, we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 10%. So we know we can do this. It's going to take some hard work though. And where it gets really hard is things like, I was about to go tell you about CPS Energy. Irrespective of what you heard about battery technology, in fact we still need to develop it. Irrespective of how much land it takes to put a solar panel out there, how many of you, if it costs nothing, would rather us be 100% solar? If it costs nothing. Okay. We do still have some really strong oil and gas fans, and that's fine. But if given the chance, if given the choice, all things being equal, would we not build a more renewable, cleaner, environmentally healthy way of producing energy? The problem is, it's not cheap. It's not inexpensive, and all things are not equal. And in 2010, we also made a strong commitment to natural gas. We built plants for natural gas production because it was lower emissions than the coal we were saying goodbye to. We're paying for that right now. So when we think about the investments we need to make to reduce the emissions for CPS, we have to consider how much it's going to cost. And so that's the analysis that we need to produce right now. And one of the commitments on the Climate Action Adaptation Plan is that we're also doing it through an equity framework. We want to make sure that, especially in communities where there are lower income families depending on energy, because there is no other choice, that we're able to make these investments and not adversely impact people who cannot afford it. We want to make sure that it doesn't matter what side of town you live on, the mom can be able to ensure that when she opens her refrigerator to feed her kids, the food is still good. I happen to believe that if we do the proper analysis, that we will show that it is actually in our net benefit, cost benefit, to make sure that we go faster on renewables, that we eliminate coal altogether faster than what even CPS is telling us, and that we commit to making sure all capacity, all new generation that we purchase, because our city's growing and we're going to need energy, that we make sure we commit to all of it being renewable. And I want the data, if I'm wrong, to prove me wrong. Not for us to just go and buy oil and gas just because that's what we're used to. But prove that doing it smarter and better is not in our best interest from a cost standpoint, but also certainly we know from a health standpoint. And then of course, how do we build a new transportation system? I'm not telling anybody to get out of their car or their truck. But has anyone here voted for light rail? Okay, I didn't mean to out anybody, but I was thinking that no one would raise their hand because number one, last time it went to voters, it failed 2-1, but also the last time it went to voters, you guys probably were still in diapers. We haven't bothered to ask San Antonians how they want to get around town in almost a generation. I believe that they want something better. I believe that we don't need to build light rail because it's going to cost too much to spread out over 500 square miles. We can actually use the technology to benefit us. You know, autonomous type vehicles that are on their own dedicated right of way that regardless of whether you're on a rail or you're on rubber tires, as long as you're getting from point A to point B reliably, frequently, and in a low emissions, comfortable way, you could care less whether it's on rails or it's on a dedicated lane. The risk is, and the difficulty is, that we've got to actually ask people that, and we've got to give leadership, civic leadership, the courage to want to ask people that, because they're still chasing ghosts from the 2002 election where light rail was defeated 2-1. But I'm committed to doing that. In fact, we have a plan for that. You'll be hearing more about, called Connect SA. It's our plan for multimodal transportation system for the city of San Antonio. Hopefully that you'll be able to ride, and your children and grandchildren will be able to ride lower emissions, faster transit, more options, and so forth. But we have to put it on the ballot, and you hopefully will be able to vote on that in November of 2020. And that is, again, almost 40% of our total emissions activities will depend on that choice. So what I'm telling you is that we have a ratified CAAP. I'm here to talk about it. I want to hear your ideas, but the work has just started, and the work is going to be tough. We see people marching in the streets all across the world. I went to Copenhagen for C40, which is the Climate Mayors Summit. I was very happy to represent San Antonio. I was honored to do it, and honored to be recognized as a global climate leader. Our city being a global climate leader here in the middle of South Texas, believe it or not, on the doorstep of one of the largest fossil fuel reserves in the entire world. We are becoming a thought leader and a civic leader in this space of making sure that we have an equitable, healthy plan to live on that also takes care of our people at home. But I would be hard pressed to go outside today and get people really excited the way I saw people in Copenhagen excited about climate. And when I say excited, I mean anxious. Because here in San Antonio, we're in a, climatologically easy place to live right about now. I mean, our summers are hot, our winters are mild. We don't have the fires that you see going on in California, although we do live with wildfire threat all the time, especially up in this area. We don't see the massive mudslides and other things that are happening, or ice caps melting and the sea levels rising. We don't feel that here in San Antonio like we do see in other parts of the world. But when I went to Copenhagen, the children in that community, when I say children, they were high schoolers, had their communities on the edge of their seats because the young people in those communities all around the world, from Africa to Germany to Canada, have their civic leaders working as hard as they possibly can on this issue, as if their lives depended on it, because it does. In fact, I heard the testimony from a young lady in Africa whose village was literally wiped off the map. The civil unrest that was occurring, the jobs that are being lost, the people who are no longer there, because of the fact that we do have climate change occurring. That is to say, to experience the issue of climate change from the eyes of someone else who may not be as lucky as we are to live in the United States, especially in this part of the United States, is to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. And just as I described, if I'm a District 8 member of the community and I'm really interested in a healthy city, I've got to be interested and concerned about neighborhoods on another side of town that are falling further and further behind. We too in the United States have to feel a little bit of sense of urgency of all of the unrest and destruction that's happening on the other side of the planet. We may not have that sense of urgency ourselves in our living rooms at night, but I think our actions should act as if we did, because it all comes around. It is national security, it is economic interest, it is business, it is health, and it is certainly our ability to operate as neighbors in an environment that we share. So I'm going to stop right there because I think I've talked a lot, but hopefully you get a sense of the fact that I am passionate about this. I think we're in a good position right now to act, but I need to hear it from you, and I need commitment from the community, especially yours, that we're going to work on it together. So, Dr. Thompson, thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for listening to me, and I'm happy to engage in the conversation.
Questions? Not all at once. There you go.
So in terms of recycling, I know that you had mentioned that we have an issue with landfills producing large quantities of gases. Do we have any plans to increase the efficiency of our recycling? I know that a number of cities offer recycling instead of one blue bin, maybe 4 blue bins, one for each of the categories, glass, aluminum, excess.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. So the question was about how are we changing our waste, or what are we doing about waste reduction, recycling, and so forth to lower our emissions through that. And I'm happy to report that that's been happening for a while now. And there has been a goal to reduce or to achieve 65% reduction of our total waste stream, I think in 2020. I would say we're not going to hit that number, but we're getting closer. One of the things that we've done is we've initiated a blue cart system, which is single stream recycling. I'm sure you're familiar with it, where you can toss all your stuff in there and everything gets sorted out into its proper recycling streams. We're continuing that effort. The other thing that we've started was an organics program. If you live in a house, you can have the option of getting a green bin where you can put compost and other compostable materials in there to help reduce help reduce the main trash landfill stream. We're also incentivizing people to reduce their own personal waste stream by shrinking the cart. And you can actually benefit from that because you pay for your waste to be processed. It's on your CPS bill. And if you choose to have a smaller cart rather than the big cart, you can actually lower the fee that you pay for solid waste management. we're still working on it. Some of the things that we still have yet to do, we have to offer the single stream recycling in apartment residences. We're not there yet. We need to do that. We also have to continue to encourage people to engage. We have to ask people to be more conscious as they recycle. In fact, one of the largest contaminants in the recycle stream, believe it or not, is dirty diapers. So we've had an award-winning program, advertising program to get people to stop throwing dirty diapers in the recycle bin. But if you needed convincing beyond that, it is this. We actually are saving taxpayers' dollars by diverting from the landfill. The cost of maintaining a landfill have actually been reduced more than the cost to institute recycling. So the more that we recycle, the more we divert waste, the more we save as a community. And that's, again, notwithstanding even the health outcomes and so forth.
Okay, so you mentioned transportation previously during your talk, and I was just wondering, like, because I was reading up on the project from Houston to Dallas, the train system that they're currently constructing. I was wondering if there's any progress on the San Antonio to Austin, like the corridor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were working on that back when Bob was on council.
I don't take credit for that.
So that is the white whale of politics in Central Texas, is to find us a way to get an Austin-San Antonio rail net linked. We do have Union Pacific. We're encouraging them to increase passenger service, but we need high-speed, reliable transit between Austin and San Antonio. For about 25 years, the legislature had authorized a group called the Lone Star Rail District to work out a solution for this. And for 25 years, they built 0 inches of rail. And it's largely, and I'll tell you, they didn't have political or financial jurisdiction to do anything. So we killed it. We said 25 years is enough of a run. We're gonna do something differently. So right now there is planning activity taking place at the metropolitan planning organizations of the Austin area and the San Antonio area, which is the group of elected officials, and they're working out various alternatives. One of them is an elevated line between Austin and San Antonio on the 35 corridor. But unfortunately, it's not anywhere near completed. So when I talk about transportation reform, this is something that we have to deal with, because we have the next great megalopolis is Austin and San Antonio. It's growing connected just like DFW, and it's fast growing. Austin is just as fast growing as San Antonio. But when I'm speaking about transportation reform, please understand that it is in San Antonio. We've got gridlock that we can see on the horizon if we don't do something in San Antonio. So that's what I'm referring to as Connect SA, which will be on your ballot in 2020. But the regional stuff we're still working on.
Hello, back here.
Yes, sir. First of all, I want to thank you for coming here. It's really appreciated. And second, I was just wondering, in our climate action program, if there was like room to accommodate for like reducing energy need and invoke energy production on a small scale. Like, for example, I read about like use like countries that actually create opportunity to cut into electricity, make them use electricity, just putting garbage on the rooftops and some costs, energy costs. I was wondering if there were any plans or any for companies to try and implement smaller, somewhat, I don't want to say less invasive, but like less controversial practices.
So you're talking about having different companies or residences be able to produce their own energy?
Simple.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and a lot of it is centered around solar and getting people to install solar and how that kind of help reduce almost to zero your energy bill. This has become a bit of a challenge, believe it or not, because you own your energy utility, and even those companies that, or even those residences that produce their own solar, they're hooked up to CPS, because eventually if that solar runs out, they're going to get their energy from CPS, and those that produce too much energy are sending it back to CPS. So it relies on the infrastructure of CPS. So when somebody goes down to net zero and they're not paying any more CPS fees, what happens to that infrastructure? It's still being used. So we need to be able to keep up with that. So right now, to answer your question, we're working on new products and programs to encourage people to adopt solar in their own areas. We're actually also working on some solutions for companies that have been producing their own electricity, but also doing it in a way structurally that helps us continue to maintain the grid. So that's only going to continue to accelerate the different options that are available. Currently we have, I think, at least 3 solar programs. It used to be only you can buy your own solar thing and put it on your roof. Now you can buy and build your own. You can actually lease your roof to have another company own it and produce energy. And then there's also community solar, where it's actually located off-site and you buy into the mini solar farm that produces energy that you can benefit from. So it's a lot of options, there are more coming.
Young lady?
Hi, so how will future development be affected by San Antonio being in ozone non-attainment?
Yeah, greatly. Thank you for that question. So, and I didn't mean that flippantly. So, so there is a Clean Air Act, and it has been somewhat defanged by the current administration, but there is a Clean Air Act. And the medical professionals, thankfully, have been driving the standards of the Clean Air Act, because at the time when it was produced, our parts per billion of pollutants in the air was, I think, around 100 parts per billion. And they have steadily ratcheted up the standard at which we could comply. The latest round of revisions brought the standard to 65 parts per billion. Thankfully, we had already been working towards that, but for the first time in our city's history, we found ourselves not in attainment. So we have to work extra hard. What happens when you're not in attainment? There are fines associated with it. There are different steps and procedures that buildings have to go through, companies have to go through if they want to build here. One of them, for instance, is for a major emitter, a big manufacturing plant, for instance, depending on the level of non-attainment that you are at, would have to show that they could do offsets. They would have to basically spend more money of their own to be able to build in your community to show that they're offsetting their own emissions. So all of this creates more challenge, takes more time to build roads because we have to show the same kind of emissions reduction based on the traffic that would be introduced. So it costs time and money the more we are in non-attainment, all for a good reason, because they want us to live up to that standard. I'm happy to say that we had done a lot of work prior to the new rules being set, that we actually limited the level of non-attainment that we were designated at. We're at marginal, which means most of these things are voluntary. They're suggestions to show that we've made progress by the time the next rulemaking happens. And so we aren't seeing fines necessarily. We're seeing some delays of projects, but if we end up in the next round not making progress, then it will start costing time and money for everybody.
Mayor's talking about low-level ozone, talking about it.
Yeah.
Young lady right over here.
I was just wondering, do you have any opportunities for students, like internships or volunteering or job shadowing for students that are interested?
Absolutely. And specifically in climate? In climate or just in general?
I guess both, since we're mostly ES students.
Yeah.
Yeah, both.
Yeah, so we're sort of building that plane as we fly it right now. And there are several different committees that are being formed to help us with the implementation phase. And as I said, implementation is the hard part. So we have a climate action advisory committee being formed, a technical advisory committee. We also have an equity committee that is all going to be working to make sure we're steering this in the right direction. And there are volunteer opportunities with that. We also have a sustainability office and essentially offices in almost every government agency that is going to try to keep us on the ball with our climate strategies. For law students, I think this area of study is actually pretty cutting edge, and there are not a lot of communities, even in San Antonio, that have the benefit of people who understand environmental law the way you will when you graduate. And that's going to, that would be very helpful for us, because some of this, even with the example of the Clean Air Act, a lot of this is trying to identify what's the best policy route for us to go to limit the impacts in our community. So I'll leave you, I think it was handed out, a brochure, but if you can email us or call
Here's
us
some
with your
of it.
contact information, we can definitely put
I
some
have some.
opportunities in front of you.
I have some over there. Okay, a couple more, and that's it. One of my graduates.
So how does the CAAP work with or collaborate with the other like smaller municipalities within San Antonio, like City of Alamo Heights, City of Hollywood Park, you know, those little smaller governments?
That's a great question. And right now, we are the pace setter. We have had conversations and we'll continue to have them through our various interagency organizations like the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which covers the county. We have had a lot of work with the county who's been at the table with the CAAP. But in terms of how we are working, interacting with the policies and operations of Alamo Heights or Chavano Park, anything like that, it really hasn't even started yet. And that is a challenge. We need to make sure that everybody's on the same page and we're not working at cross purposes. But you know, the good news in that is that San Antonio is the big 800-pound gorilla in the room. Our emissions far outweigh our other constituent cities. But that is a great point, and that's something for political leadership, myself included, to be working towards as this gets implemented.
One more. Who can yell the loudest? No, don't do that. This young lady right there.
I was wondering when we're gonna have major reconstruction to highways, considering how much traffic we have and how much of the same roads we've been driving on for years. I was wondering when there was gonna be a big change to our highway system through the city.
So road construction in Texas has been watching ice melt. And believe it or not, it's happening right before your eyes. And I want to submit to you that it's all not a good idea, even though it's happening. And part of the challenge is our state, if you haven't noticed, is on a different schedule than our cities in terms of its priorities. Everything from health to mental health to guns to you name it. We're not always on the same page. And this is one of those areas. The state has had a policy of just building highways. And we know that's not a solution for a sustainable future, even if we're just concerned about transport congestion. But it is happening. 1604 is getting expanded. 281, 35, I-10, the same thing. I would submit to you the juice is not worth the squeeze. And if you need proof of that, just wait 2 more years till I-10 and 1604 are totally shut down because they're rebuilding that infrastructure. They're rebuilding that interchange. Avoid that area if you can. But let me make the point. Part of this challenge is that San Antonio is sprawled, right? And it's very difficult to service and maintain a sustainable area that's sprawled. The highway system is largely responsible for that. If you drive down 281 right now, you can see just what's going to happen to that area of the community, which also happens to be the most sensitive area of the recharge zone of our aquifer, by the way. What's going to happen there? You're going to have, right now, before we even get densified in the urban core, you're going to have extraordinary amounts of development that is about 15 miles away from the urban core that we are going to have to service. And that's as a result of it getting much easier for us to drive there. So it's a solution, temporary one, to congestion that's happening there, and it's good for the people who live there, but it's only going to attract more congestion and more sprawl that is going to further challenge the goal that we're setting for ourselves. So some of this is already baked, it's going to happen, but we're trying to steer ourselves locally first, but also at the state level to a more sustainable future. Don't give up hope. When you guys are old enough, or when you guys have interest enough to serve at those levels in state government, hopefully you can change that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hold it up.
Thank you all.